It's simply to give the context of the museum itself in Baghdad, a little about its history. Archaeology, loosely defined, was nothing new to Iraq. Arab historians for centuries had written about the kingdoms and empires, the ruins amidst them, and at the same time, modern archaeology is a European invention. We'll hear more about that, of the 18th and 19th century. For Iraq, archaeology began with a guy called Austin Layard. He was a wealthy upper-class Englishman who in 1847 explored Nineveh, which is across the river, Tigris River from Mosul, and the palace there of the Assyrian king Sennacherib. Now, in the palace was an inscription describing Sennacherib's attack on Jerusalem in 701 BC, which conformed to the biblical account in Kings 2, which made everyone in England very happy when they heard about it. It was published in England, and it engendered considerable interest in an England that at that time was very self-consciously Christian and interested in anything having to do with biblical studies. So the second half of the century saw lots more explorers, some of them professional archaeologists from the British Museum, moving in many cases, discovering sites, writing them up when they went home, or bringing statues, stelae, friezes, anything that they could that was of monumental value anyway, back to England to put in the British Museum. Layard himself moved several of the Assyrian collection items in the British Museum that are there today, which are spectacular sites, actually. Alongside all of this, there was the private market. There were plenty of people interested in artifacts and buying them and purchasing them, owning them in some fashion, owning history. Lots of English country manors sported Iraqi statues and stelae in their gardens. Archaeology in those days wasn't quite the same thing as it is, say, 60 years later. At that time, Europe was caught up in world conquest, empire building. It felt itself to be the rightful inheritors of past civilizations, all of the old empires. The ones, they felt themselves to be the ones who knew best on how to take care of such antiquities, ancient monuments. But times changed. There was a fundamental shift with the First World War, at the end of which empires like Britain and France no longer, it was felt, should have colonies. Instead, they, along I might point out with the United States, would have mandates. Now, colony was attached to the home country. All goods flowed to the home country. A mandate, however, was presumed to stand on its own, to have its own history, to have its own museum. By 1923, Iraq, a new country emerging from the morass of the First World War, amazingly had the beginnings of one. It was largely due to luck and a lady called Gertrude Bell, who was named head in 1923 of the Directorate of the Iraqi Antiquities. That was her official title, among other titles that she had. Gertrude Bell was recruited in 1915 as one of several British archaeologists acting as intelligence agents, spies in other words, to serve in the Middle East during the First World War. Yeah. Lawrence was one. You've all heard of Lawrence, of course. Both were recruited by Hogarth. Himself was an Oxford archaeologist. The archaeologists dominated Middle East intelligence networks. Now, why Bell? Well, because as an archaeologist, she had for the previous 20 years traveled extensively throughout Syria and Iraq, visiting ruins. She knew the tribes, their leaders. She did this all on her own, amazingly. An English woman wandering through the Syrian desert, or northern Saudi Arabia for that matter. Anyway, traveling extensively throughout Syria and Iraq, visiting ruins, she knew the tribes, their leaders personally. Above all, she spoke better Arabic than any of the Englishmen in the theater of operations. She was a phenomenon. Not surprisingly, by the end of the war, after, 5 years there, she had gravitated to the post of Oriental Secretary. That was her official title, the chief advisor of the High Commissioner, Sir Percy Cox. She's an amazing woman. About the only woman there on the British side, as a matter of fact. It was, initially, she wanted to go out to Iraq when the war broke out in 1914 and applied to do so and was told that this was no place for women. And so she dutifully waited for a year until the British government, desperate, recruited her.